You are listening to Ashes and Candlelight, a place for quiet stories told in the dark, where the noise of the day can soften at the edges. If you find this kind of long-form history helpful, you're welcome to subscribe to the channel and like the video. It helps this work reach others who use history to rest or reflect. If you're settling down to sleep, let the world around you slow a little. Let the last thoughts of the day drift to the side. There's nothing you need to do except follow the sound of the story. Tonight, we walk a long road through the past, from a silent lake in the mountains to the crowded streets of Europe. A road lit only by memory and by the small flame we carry with us. When you're ready, we'll begin. High in the mountains of Central Asia, there is a lake the colour of deep sky. Even in summer, snow rests in the hollows around it, and the wind moves across the grass in long, slow breaths. If you walk along the shore, you will find stones set carefully into the earth. Not grand markers, just hand-cut slabs, each carved with a name and with a date. 1338, 1339. Sometimes the word pestilence. We do not know the voices of the people who carved them. We only know that they lived in a place of silence, a silence so wide that it seemed to hold its own weather. A few of these stones were taken up long ago by archaeologists who studied the pollen caught in the carvings, the grains trapped in the cracks. From that pollen came a clue so faint it almost feels like memory, that a sickness lived here, in the burrows of marmots, in the grasses that hid their city of tunnels, in the fleas that waited for warmth. A sickness that smouldered quietly, year after year, as steady as a winter star. The world beyond this valley had no idea. Caravans moved across the steppe, carrying silk and salt and stories. Empires rose and quarrelled and made peace again. But here, on this quiet shore, something ancient was shifting. We stand at the beginning of a road that no one saw. A road made not of stone or packed earth, but of chance meetings. A trapped flea, a hungry rodent, a cold night that drove an animal closer to a campfire than usual. From these small crossings, an unthinkable journey began. But we will not hurry. Tonight, we walk it gently, as though holding a lantern in unfamiliar country. In the years that follow these carved stones, rumour will move faster than caravans, and caravans will move faster than kings. A shadow will travel along rivers and coasts, through gates and across thresholds, until its shape touches almost every life in Europe. But for now, we remain here for a moment longer, by the water, in the thin mountain air. The lake is still, the stones keep their watch, and the wind carries nothing but the sound of its own passing. When you are ready, we will take the first step away from this shore and follow the quiet road the world could not see. The Black Death was a sickness. It was also a journey, of tiny lives riding larger ones along the roads people made. Physicians then spoke of corrupted air and unbalanced humours. We use other words now. A bacterium, Yersinia pestis, living inside a flea. The flea living on a rodent. The rodent living close to us. Tonight we'll keep the lanterns of the 1340s lit. But when the path is dark, we will pause for a small light. A quiet note of what we now know. Imagine the steppe at dawn. A horizon so broad it feels like a held breath, and the pale light spreading across grass that sways like a slow sea. a place where silence has its own depth, and where life has been negotiating its survival for thousands of years. Beneath this grass, whole cities lie hidden. Not human cities, but burrows. Endless networks of tunnels and chambers carved by marmots, susliks, and gerbils. A civilization of small, warm-blooded bodies, each carrying its own habits, its own seasons, its own tiny dramas. For most of history, the sickness that lived here stayed here. It passed from rodent to flea, from flea to rodent again, a cycle so old and so stable that it almost behaved like weather. A rise in one population, a fall in another. A harsh winter thinning the burrows, a gentle spring bringing them back. It did not need to leave the steppe, and the steppe did not need to send it anywhere. But the 14th century began to change the rhythm of things. The climate shifted. Some years brought long droughts, which drove animals from their burrows in desperate search of water. Other years brought sudden rains, flooding the ground and forcing species together that normally kept to their own territories. Fleas, whose whole lives depend on warmth and blood, lost their regular hosts and became less selective. A marmot one day, a goat the next, a horse if it was still enough, and sometimes the fur-clad hunter who crouched too close to a burrow. The sickness, a quiet inhabitant of the steppe, now brushed against human skin, not often, not predictably, and not yet with consequences that would echo across continents, but the spark was struck. Trade, at the same time, was tightening the world's weave. Caravans threaded their way across the grasslands, long lines of men and animals carrying salt, spices, cloth, and stories worth their weight in coin. They stopped at wells known only to those who had made the journey before. They sheltered at small enclosures where the wind carved shapes in the dust. And they rested at the Mongol yam stations, relay posts stocked with fresh horses and warm food, so that messages could cross Asia with astonishing speed. These travellers paid attention to everything: the smell of the wind, the softness of the ground underfoot, the sounds of wolves at night, and the customs of the towns that welcomed or mistrusted them. The silk roads were not a single line, but a braided net of routes that opened, closed, and redirected themselves like rivers. In the late 1340s, another traveller joined these roads. It carried no bundle, spoke no language, and left no footprints. It simply moved, quietly, from host to host. A flea in the fur of a rodent hiding in a bag of grain loaded onto a caravan, and a caravan bound for the great ports of the Black Sea. Crimea lay at the edge of this world, a place where land routes met sea routes, and where empires watched each other across water. The city of Kaffa, held by the Genoese, was one of the brightest maritime pearls of its time. A tangle of stone streets, warehouses, markets, and the smell of spices and tar drifting together in the heat. Italian merchants haggled with Armenian traders, Greek sailors, and Tatar caravan leaders who had crossed half a continent to reach the quays. But Kaffa was also a place of strain. The Golden Horde held the lands around it, and its khans kept a wary eye on the Genoese fortifications and their profitable trade. In 1346, tensions snapped. Political disputes, unpaid debts, and quarrels between Christian and Muslim traders gave the Khan, Janibeg, reason enough to lay siege to the city. His army encircled Kaffa, horsemen with composite bows, engineers with trebuchets, and supply lines that stretched across the steppe with the efficiency of a well-trained heartbeat. Inside the walls, the Genoese closed their gates and rationed their grain. They repaired cracks from bombardments, argued about strategy, and watched the horizon for relief ships that might arrive, or might not. It was a familiar story, a siege of patience, a contest of endurance and logistics. But then, something invisible entered the Mongol camp. Men who had been riding at dawn were feverish by midday, and dead before the next sunrise. Tents became charnel houses. Horses stamped in fear at the scent of sickness. Trebuchets grew silent as crews collapsed beside them. Yanibeg, seeing his army unravelling, was consumed by rage and desperation. Unable to break the walls, he ordered what chroniclers would later describe as an act of terrible theatre. Corpses, swollen, darkened, and heavy with the unseen sickness, were loaded into the trebuchets and hurled over Kaffa's walls. Whether these bodies carried the plague into the city in any meaningful way is uncertain. Modern scholars believe the rats and fleas, already hiding in the grain stores, were far more decisive. But the psychological weight of bodies falling from the sky, that left its own kind of mark. One Genoese notary, Gabriele de Musi, hearing the accounts from survivors, wrote of the dead flying through the air, and the defenders unable to hide or flee or escape. Inside the walls, fear thickened. Sailors begged for space on outbound ships. Families fled to the harbour, carrying whatever they could lift. There was no strategy left, only escape. When the galleys finally pulled away from Kaffa, their decks were crowded with sweating, frightened men, and with something else. Fleas in the seams of clothing, rats in the grain, and the slow, unhurried movement of a sickness that was about to step onto a much wider stage. The caravans had brought it to the sea. Now the ships would carry it to Europe, and ships travel faster than rumours. The lantern burns low here. We stand at the edge of the water, listening to the ropes creak and the gulls cry, and in a moment we will follow these galleys to the first ports that will feel the change. The ships that fled Kaffa did not travel as a fleet. Some limped south along the Crimean coast. Others cut west across open water, their sails patched, their decks crowded with men who had slept little and prayed much. Each ship carried its own small world, sailors whispering in dialects from Genoa, Pisa, Messina, Marseille, a few merchants clutching ledgers gone useless, and the quieter passengers no one had invited, fleas in the seams of clothing, rats curled in sacks of millet, the faint tremor of fever in bodies that had not yet begun to ache. The sea was calm that season. A calm sea can speed disaster more surely than a storm. Tradition says that Sicily met the plague first. A galley entered the harbour of Messina, just as autumn settled on the island. Messina sits in a bowl of hills, its water sheltered, its streets narrow, its markets always beginning the day an hour too early. When the ship anchored, the quayside life responded automatically. Dock workers straightened their backs, clerks dipped quills, vendors tightened the ropes on fruit stalls. The ship brought a certain pace, and the city met that pace without thinking. Then the first sailors stumbled down the gangplank, some coughing, some swaying, and some already too weak to disguise their fever. What happened next moved faster than the official records. Doors closed earlier that evening. Mothers called children inside with sharper voices. A rumour crossed the market square before the sun set. There is a sickness on the ships. The next morning, another rumour. It kills within days. And the morning after that, it comes from the east. People listened, but they also remembered. Sicily had known outbreaks before. Fevers, fluxes, infant deaths. Illness was no stranger here. What unsettled them was speed. No sickness they knew moved like this. The departing ships made the problem worse. Some were refused entry. Others were ordered away as soon as their condition was seen. But a turned-away ship does not vanish. It merely looks for another harbour. One vessel, denied in Sicily, sailed north and made for Genoa. When Genoa refused it, it continued toward Pisa. If Pisa turned it back, it sought Marseille, or a smaller Provençal port, where harbour masters could be bribed, or where sickness was harder to detect in the bustle of a busy morning. Harbours in the 14th century were porous places, lanes of water where goods, people, languages, and illnesses mixed freely. Cargo moved by hand, rats moved by rope, fleas moved by breath and cloth, news moved by mouths that whispered in taverns even when the day's work was done. Gently creaking mast, small gust of wind. In Marseille, the old port collected sounds like a shell collects the sea. The slap of water against stone, the chatter of fishmongers, the call of a priest urging caution, softened by the salt air. A chronicler there wrote that the sickness came with the breath of strangers, though he did not yet connect it with ships or grain. He described a market that grew cautious overnight. Stalls set out fewer wares. Customers lingered less. Even the gulls seemed to circle with an unfamiliar patience, as though waiting for something they could sense but not see. And still the movement continued. Ships that had been denied in Marseille sailed along the coast toward Toulon, or crossed to Palma, or made for the Rhone estuary, where fishermen traded at dawn. Every new landing allowed the invisible traveller to step ashore again. Cities have personalities. Even in fear, they reveal them. Genoa believed in contracts and margins. Its merchants calculated risk even when the rumours grew thick. Pisa trusted in its physicians, who prescribed purgatives and prayer in equal measure. Venice, always watching the horizon, sent boats to intercept suspicious vessels long before they reached the lagoon. But belief does not outrun biology. From Sicily to Genoa, from Marseille to Montpellier, from Pisa to Venice, the same pattern played out. A few sudden deaths, a tightness in the streets, candles burning a little later than usual, and the whisper spreading from quarter to quarter. There's something in the air. Medieval people feared bad air, miasma, more than contagion. Air could not be reasoned with. Air slipped under doors. Air moved with the weather. To breathe was to risk. Priests processed with incense. Physicians lit small fires in courtyards to purify the breeze. Households burned rosemary and juniper, hoping to sweeten whatever invisible corruption drifted by. Children wore little posy bundles, lavender, thyme, crushed petals, their scent a fragile shield. But fear is porous. It seeps. And as each port felt the first swell of the epidemic, the next port in line was already preparing without knowing what it was preparing for. In every harbour there is a ledger, a book where cargo, arrivals, and payments are marked with steady strokes of ink. Clerks are trained to write neatly, to leave clean margins, to end each day's column with a final, confident line. In these months, the last lines grew shorter. A clerk set down his pen. The next page began in a different hand. The sickness moved faster than the ships now, faster than warnings, faster than prayers. We will leave the ports here for a moment. The gulls circling, the masts swaying, the bells marking hours that feel suddenly heavier. Ahead of us are the inland roads, the cities, and the people who tried to understand what had arrived at their thresholds. The cities of the 14th century were tight knots of life. Stone walls for defence, markets for trade, churches for rhythm. Above, wooden beams hung low and warm, trapping heat and smoke, while below, waste ran in narrow lanes toward the rivers. Grain was stored in lofts, rushes laid thick on floors, cats prowled for scraps, and every habit that made a medieval town comfortable for people made it perfect for rats. The streets were rarely silent. Carts creaked, vendors called, church bells marked hours that governed work and prayer alike. Even at night, a city breathed, with footsteps, voices, animals stirring in the dark. When the sickness entered these places, it entered a world already full of breath. A single ship in a harbour could seed a city. A single street could feed the plague for months. By winter, Florence heard of it. By spring, Paris knew. In England they spoke of a pestilence moving like weather, invisible, but felt. To understand how people responded, we have to breathe their air for a moment. Science and spirit were the same language then. Doctors studied Galen, priests studied Genesis, and both agreed that when the body, or the world, fell out of balance, corruption was allowed to rise. The body, they said, held four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health was their harmony. Too much blood made a man feverish, too little left him pale, and when the plague came, physicians prescribed what they knew: bleeding, purging, burning herbs, acts of restoration that they believed, not cruelty. Air mattered above all else. Air could rot, air could poison, air could betray. Physicians wore long robes, homes burned juniper, churches filled with incense, and public fires were lit in courtyards and crossroads to cleanse whatever invisible corruption drifted on the breeze. People spoke of eclipses and comets, of planetary conjunctions, of signs written in the heavens. From Paris came a report, written in careful Latin, declaring that the alignment of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn in March of 1345 had poisoned the air with heat and moisture. The document was copied across Europe. People nodded. It explained everything. No one yet guessed that the danger moved closer to the ground. In Avignon, the surgeon Guy de Chauliac stayed at his post. He lanced swellings, bled patients, and recorded what he saw. He lived, though most of those he treated did not. Later, he wrote that the disease appeared in two forms. One brought swellings in the groin and armpit, painful, frightening, but sometimes survivable. The other struck the lungs directly, turning breath itself into a weapon. He did not know the words bubonic or pneumonic, but he had seen the difference between flesh that might heal and breath that could not. Modern medicine would later recognize a third form, when the infection floods the blood itself. But to those living through it, all forms began the same way. With fever, with dread, with the sudden sense that something had gone terribly wrong. Faith offered its own diagnosis. Preachers cried that the pestilence was judgment. Processions wound through the streets carrying relics, chanting litanies meant to cleanse the air, while candles guttered in the wind, and behind them walked the flagellants, men stripped to the waist, striking their backs until they bled, begging God to see their pain and spare the world. No one looked for fleas. The eye was turned inward, towards sin. People carried pomanders, small metal globes filled with vinegar and herbs, hoping to sweeten the air they breathed. In England, posies became common. Lavender, rosemary, marjoram, tucked into sleeves and collars. Centuries later, a nursery rhyme would echo the gesture. Ring a roses, a pocket full of posies. Its origins uncertain, but its instinct unmistakable. The human wish to hold beauty against decay. The wealthy fled to country villas. The poor shut their shutters and prayed. Some families never opened them again. Blame followed fear. Foreigners were mistrusted, travellers avoided, and in some places, Jewish communities were accused of poisoning wells, a lie that spread as quickly as the sickness itself. Violence followed. Expulsions, killings, entire neighbourhoods erased, not by plague, but by panic. Animals were blamed too. Cats and dogs were destroyed in great numbers, removing the very creatures that had kept rats in check. Every attempt to explain the plague reshaped the city in small, tragic ways. And yet, through all of it, life continued. Letters were written, bread was baked, prices were argued over, marriages were arranged. One father in Siena wrote that he buried his children himself. Another in England wrote simply that the ground was too full. Their words still carry the weight of disbelief. The bells did not stop. They counted the dying until even the bell ringers were gone, and still the candles burned. And for a moment, we can stop there. Not to explain anything further, not to add another cause or theory, but simply to sit with the world as it felt. A city at night, after the bells had finished, after the last cart had passed. Smoke hanging low between rooftops. A single window still lit. Footsteps fading into distance. People lay awake, listening to the sounds that remained, wondering which would still be there in the morning. Some counted prayers. Some counted breaths. Some listened for a knock that did not come. No one yet knew what the future would demand of them, only that dawn would arrive, and that life, in whatever form it still had, would ask to be lived again. We don't need to hurry past this moment. History often moves quickly on the page, but it did not feel quick to those inside it. For them, time stretched. Hours grew long, nights longer still. And beneath fear, beneath belief, beneath blame, there was something quieter taking shape. The simple act of enduring. Holding on, waiting, breathing. And when the next day came, as it always did, the city opened its eyes again. When words fail a time, they leave fragments. The years of plague gave us just enough voices to feel its shape. Letters, chronicles, marginal notes, ink surviving where flesh could not. These voices do not speak loudly. They do not argue or explain. They simply record what passed in front of them, often without knowing how to finish the sentence. In Siena, a clerk wrote that the city's people died by the hundreds each day, and that fathers and mothers abandoned their own children. He ended mid-sentence. The next line, written in a different hand, speaks only of the graves. From Damascus, a scholar described the pestilence as a wind that comes from the land of darkness. He wrote that it travelled east to west, devouring Persians, Tartars, and Arabs alike, and that its pace was beyond reason, a day's journey of contagion for every hour of flight. In Cairo, the sound of morning prayers rose with the call to prayer itself. One chronicle tells of bodies carried to the mosques until the courtyards were filled and people prayed among the shrouds. Across languages and faiths, the same phrases appear again and again: pestilence, fever, swellings, divine anger. Every script wrote it differently, but the music was the same. For the first time in recorded history, humanity saw itself as one body, sick together, not in theory, not in metaphor, but in the simple fact that suffering now crossed borders faster than armies and spared no creed. Lantern note: gentle, spoken softly. Modern historians estimate that between a third and a half of Europe perished, with similar proportions across the Middle East and North Africa. Yet even in those reckonings, there are losses that cannot be counted: children unnamed, graves unmarked, villages that left no chronicle behind. In Florence, Giovanni Boccaccio watched the city empty street by street. He wrote of neighbours who would not touch the sick, of friendships dissolved overnight, and of those who fled to the hills with songs and wine, thinking joy itself might act as a charm against the air. In Avignon, Guy de Chauliac worked until the plague reached him. He recovered, and later wrote that many died not of the sickness itself, but of the cures: bleeding, lancing, purging. Rituals meant to restore balance that only drained strength away. When faith met failure, fear turned inward. Some blamed strangers. Some blamed travellers or the poor. In parts of Germany, whole Jewish communities were accused of poisoning wells. They were burned in their synagogues, or driven from towns they had lived in for generations. Even in terror, people sought order. Even cruelty was for some an attempt to explain the unexplainable. Yet there were other responses too. Priests who stayed to anoint the dying. Physicians who wrote what they saw instead of what they hoped. Neighbours who carried water when families were too weak to fetch it themselves. These are the quieter acts that thread through the darkness. A monk in England wrote that he had lost all his brothers, but the bells still needed ringing for them. So he learned to pull every rope alone. He called it a service of memory. If you are half asleep, you can rest here for a while. We will keep walking slowly. History will wait. The sickness did not burn itself out in a single wave. It paused, thinned, and rose again. People learned that closing a gate could save a town. That distance might preserve a family. Without words for contagion, they began to understand its logic. And when at last the air cleared, the survivors stepped outside into a world that looked the same but sounded emptier. Fields lay untended, mills stood silent, streets echoed. But somewhere, someone always sang again. The words that survive from these years are uneven. Some are careful, some are rushed. Some stop suddenly, as if the hand holding the pen could not go on. What they share is not detail, but weight. It was not only the dead who were missing, it was the future as it had once been imagined. Plans were set aside, journeys left unfinished, lives reduced suddenly to the work of one day at a time. And yet, beneath the fear and the confusion, something quieter began to take shape. A knowledge, learned slowly and without words, that nothing was guaranteed, and therefore nothing was ordinary. A loaf of bread, a voice at the door, a morning without bells. These years did not end with certainty. They ended with people still standing, looking at one another, and understanding that survival itself had become a shared task. For now, that was enough. To follow the sickness, we can follow its passengers. A flea, no heavier than dust, carrying the seed of death within its belly. A rat, warm and social, carrying the flea. A ship full of grain and men, carrying them both. When the ship makes harbour, the rats disembark first, down the ropes, across the stones, into the granaries. The fleas leap from fur to sleeve, from sleeve to skin. No fanfare, no omen, only hunger. The plague moved along the same paths that made the world prosperous. Trade routes, pilgrimage roads, rivers that had carried goods for centuries. Human closeness was its map. Those paths were not abstract. They were the routes people trusted. A wool road used every autumn. A river crossed at the same ford for generations. A market held on the same saint's day, year after year. People followed them because they were familiar. And the sickness followed because familiarity meant repetition. What moved once could move again. What returned brought memory with it. In some winters, the rats died in great numbers, their bodies bloated in cellars and holds. In other years, the fleas turned desperate, seeking warmth wherever it could be found. In the cold months, when people gathered close to survive the weather, the sickness travelled by touch, by shared blankets, by kindness itself. There were years when the plague seemed to sleep. Then spring came. Animals stirred. Markets reopened. Cloth and grain moved again from hand to hand. And with them, so did the sickness. Not as a surprise, but as a return. This rhythm became familiar, even if it was never understood. Fear learned a calendar. Climate made its own small edits to the story. A colder year slowed the insects. A wet spring fattened the harvest, and the rats that shared it. The mid-14th century sat on the edge of unsettled weather. Failed crops, thin bodies, less resistance. The plague did not arrive alone. It arrived where hunger had already been. The sickness did not spread evenly. There were valleys spared, villages that watched the smoke from afar, towns that closed their gates just in time. Imagine one place, untouched at first. News arrives before illness. A rumour at the tavern. A trader who does not stay the night. The gates close. Visitors are turned away. Weeks pass. Nothing happens. The gates open again. A cart enters, then another. And quietly, without ceremony, the pattern begins. No town knew if it was safe, only whether it had been lucky so far. Fear travelled with the sickness. When gates closed, rumour slipped through the cracks. People spoke of poisoned wells, of strangers, of the air itself. Physicians burned aromatic wood in the streets. In some cities, fires were lit at crossroads and squares to cleanse the vapours. It was an act of faith, and sometimes, accidentally, an act of protection. The fires did not purify the heavens, but they drove insects away. They thinned crowds. They changed how closely people gathered. Not knowing why something worked did not prevent it from working. By then, many had learned not to ask when it would end. They asked instead, who is still here? What still needs doing? What can wait until tomorrow? Those were questions the sickness could not answer. And after each passing, people waited. Not for certainty, but for signs. A market that stayed quiet. A road used again without comment. A neighbour who did not cough. Days stretched. Weeks followed. Nothing happened. And then, somewhere else, the pattern began again. Not everywhere. Not all at once. Only enough to remind the world that what had moved before could move again. People began to notice small things. Which seasons felt safer. Which roads were best avoided. How long a stranger might stay before fear followed. They did not speak of protection. They spoke of luck, of air that felt different this year, of a feeling that could not be named. But beneath the words, a recognition slowly formed. The sickness was not random. It followed warmth. It followed trade. It followed habit. Once seen, it could not be unseen. A ship delayed in harbour felt prudent, not weak. A closed gate felt careful, not cruel. Waiting became a form of care, not because it was understood, but because it was remembered. This knowledge did not arrive at once. It gathered slowly, from places spared, from places struck twice, from years that felt gentler than the last. It settled into custom, into how doors were answered, into how travellers were greeted, into how long people were willing to wait before trusting the world again. And so, as 1348 turned to 1349, ships once again filled their holds and set sail, northward toward the Channel. The plague followed, not as a storm, but as a tide. The Channel is a narrow stretch of water, but it holds a wide memory. Romans crossed it with legions. Normans crossed it with banners. Now, in the summer of 1348, traders and refugees crossed it with something smaller than fear and stronger than faith. The harbours on both shores smelled of tar and grain and salt fish. On the English side, ropes slapped against damp wood. Casks were rolled ashore. Accounts were settled. In the south, Bristol counted itself lucky. Its docks busy, its markets open, its merchants wary of tales from abroad. Then, in August, a ship arrived from Bordeaux. By September, the bell ringers were earning overtime. The sickness climbed the river valleys, from Bristol to Gloucester, from Southampton to Winchester. England was a web of trade and pilgrimage. Its knots now became traps. Wool, wine, grain, people, all moved along the same arteries. What fed the kingdom now fed the disease. By winter, the first cases reached London. Chroniclers wrote that the cold was bitter that year, that the river carried ice at its edges, that the poor huddled closer than ever for warmth. The plague did not care for seasons. It walked the Thames by night, from wharf to warehouse, to tavern to church. In some parishes, half the priests were dead. In others, the gravediggers buried each other. A clerk at Westminster wrote that people began to die, as thick as autumn leaves. He stopped writing before Christmas. When people are afraid, they count. They count the days since the last bell. The names on a roll. The beds still filled. In London, the living counted the carts. In the burial fields beyond the walls, the earth grew warm from the turning of spades. One chronicler said that at Smithfield and at Spitalfields, the trenches were dug so deep that bodies lay in layers and the soil rose like bread. The city carried on because it had to. Merchants still traded. Bakers still baked. The Crown appointed new officials faster than they died. The great clock of Westminster still chimed the hours, though fewer ears heard it. Some blamed the air. Some blamed the foreigners who had come with the wine fleets. Some blamed themselves. The Archbishop preached repentance. Physicians prescribed smoke and vinegar. But beneath the fear ran a quieter instinct. To endure. A mother washing linens by the river. A mason sharpening his tools. A boy lighting a candle for his father. Each a thread that refused to snap. By the spring of 1349, the first great wave had spent itself. The disease did not disappear. It merely slept, waiting for another generation's warmth. When people emerged again, London looked unchanged. The same streets, the same river, the same sky, but everything beneath it had shifted. Wages rose, fields lay empty for want of hands. Servants became masters. The old order trembled. In that vacuum of loss, a new kind of world began to form. Inside a monastery near the river, a monk wrote a single sentence on a fresh page. Here ends the mortality, and here begins the reckoning. The road that began beside a blue lake in the mountains had reached the bend of the Thames. It would travel north, east, and back again in smaller waves for centuries to come. But for this night, we set down our pack. And as we rest here for a while, it is winter that settles around the memory. Cold did what fear could not. It slowed the streets. It quieted the roads. It pressed people inward, toward hearths and walls and one another. Days became smaller. The work of the morning, the work of the evening, the space between, filled with waiting. People learned the sound of carts before they saw them. They learned the weight of earth on wood. They learned how many steps it took to walk to the burial fields and back. The city did not grieve all at once. Grief arrived in fragments, in the absence of a voice, in a doorway no longer opened, in a name that no one spoke aloud any more. And still, the hours were kept. Bread was baked, water was drawn, candles were lit and blown out again. Survival became quiet, not heroic, not explained, just repeated. One day followed another, one winter followed the last, and beneath the cold and the loss, something held, thin, stubborn, uncelebrated, the simple refusal to stop. After the first great wave passed, the world did not rush forward. It waited, not everywhere at once, and not with understanding, but with a shared uncertainty that settled like frost. Roads were still there, but quieter. Fields lay open, their furrows untouched longer than usual. In some towns, markets reopened cautiously. In others, stalls stayed shuttered, their owners unsure whether returning meant survival or invitation. News moved slowly now. Messengers took longer routes. Letters arrived, folded thin with handling, carrying stories already softened by distance. In one place, the sickness seemed gone. In another, it lingered just long enough to remind people not to trust the silence. What followed was not peace, but suspension. Winter helped. Cold thinned gatherings. Firelight drew families inward. The dark came early, and with it, a reason to stay behind doors. People began to notice the absence of noise. Fewer carts at dawn, fewer arguments in the square. Even the dogs barked less. It was not relief they felt, but caution, a sense that the world was listening. Across regions, habits shifted in small ways. Travellers were questioned more closely. Strangers were asked where they had slept and how long they intended to stay. In some places, visitors were asked to wait outside the walls, in barns or sheds, or empty houses at the edge of town. Not forever, just long enough. Time itself began to feel like a barrier. No one called this policy. No one wrote it into law. It emerged quietly, from memory rather than instruction. A delay that felt prudent, a pause that felt protective. Not yet fixed, not yet formal. Long enough for fear to subside, or declare itself. The world learned to wait without knowing why. In ports, ships sat at anchor longer than before. Sails furled, cargo untouched. From the shore, people counted days by the tide, by the weather, by the slow patience of hulls rocking in place. Some captains protested. Others complied without complaint. Waiting cost less than burial. Inland, roads thinned further. Pilgrims delayed journeys, merchants consolidated routes. Where once paths braided tightly together, now they loosened, not broken, just less eager. Even the great networks of trade seemed to breathe in and out, expanding, contracting, as if the world itself were learning how much closeness it could afford. This waiting did not feel hopeful. Hope implies expectation. What people felt instead was restraint, a careful narrowing of life to what was necessary. Food, fire, familiar faces. Everything else could wait. Faith adjusted too. Prayers continued, but with a quieter tone. Less demand, more endurance. Churches stood open, but thinner in attendance. Candles burned, but fewer at a time. The language of sermons softened. Less warning. More instruction on how to live with uncertainty. In homes, people reorganized their days. They counted who was still under the roof. They rearranged sleeping spaces. They learned which neighbours remained and which houses stood empty. Memory became practical. Who could be relied upon? Who had disappeared? Who still answered the door? The future was no longer planned far ahead. It was measured in days that passed quietly. This pause was uneven. Some regions were struck again quickly. Others enjoyed longer calm. No map could explain why. Luck still played its part, but luck now was observed more carefully. People began to sense patterns, even when they could not explain them. That certain roads felt dangerous, that certain seasons carried risk, that stillness, for a time, could be protective. Nothing about this waiting was heroic. It did not make songs. It did not fill chronicles. But it changed behaviour. And behaviour, slowly repeated, becomes culture. The world did not yet understand contagion, but it was learning distance. Not isolation, just space. Space between bodies. Space between arrivals. Space between danger and decision. Time became a tool, even before it became a rule. And so between waves, the world held itself still, listening, not knowing whether the silence meant safety or only delay, but choosing, for now, not to rush back into noise. This was not the end of fear, but it was the first moment when people sensed that survival might depend not only on prayer or strength, but on patience. When the sickness finally loosened its grip, Europe did not rise with a single breath. It stirred slowly, like a person waking after a long fever, unsure of where the dream ended and the daylight began. Fields lay open to the sky, unploughed. Workshops stood with tools still resting where hands had dropped them months before. And the roads were quieter than anyone alive could remember. For the people who remained, life had changed in ways too large to grasp at once. They stepped into a world that felt strange, hollow in places, fuller in others. A world that needed them in ways it never had before. Labour had become rare. For centuries, a lord might own broad fields and deep woods, confident that hands would always be there to tend them. Now the fields were empty. The hands were few. A ploughman could ask for double his old wage. A thatcher might be offered food, silver, even a small cottage just to stay through the winter. And for the first time in generations, people discovered they could choose the life they wanted, not only the life they were born to. Some packed their belongings in a bundle and walked away from the manor that had claimed their family's labour for centuries. They followed rumours of better pay, kinder lords, towns hiring carpenters, villages that needed shepherds. For a little while, the road itself became a place of hope. But hope, like fear, reshapes the world unevenly. The ruling classes felt the shift at once, like the ground moving under their feet. To them, the fixed hierarchy of the old world had been a kind of law of nature. A peasant was meant to stay a peasant. A lord was meant to command. A world where wages rose and labourers wandered freely felt like a world without gravity. In England, the king tried to pull the old order tight again. A law was written, the Statute of Labourers, declaring that no man should take higher wages than he had earned before the plague, and no lord should offer them. It was an attempt to hold back a tide with a handful of sand, and like sand, it slipped through every grasp. Men paid each other in coin passed quietly across tables. Women worked for neighbours instead of masters. Strong backs named their price. The law remained ink on parchment. The world moved on. Inheritance, too, changed the shape of things. Whole branches of families were gone. Entire households stood empty. A distant cousin, a surviving daughter, a single remaining brother might suddenly inherit lands, tools, savings, contracts they had never expected. In Venice, in Florence, in Ghent, new wealth pooled in unexpected corners. Merchants found fewer rivals. Bankers expanded cautiously at first, and then with confidence. A new class slowly rose, not born to title, but to opportunity. It was not equality, but it was movement. The great pyramid of medieval society began to loosen. And then there was the wound no ledger could record. Trust had thinned. For many, the plague had felt like a world abandoned by God. Priests had died early, bravely, tending the sick. Monasteries lost whole communities. Churches lost their voices. The faithful continued to pray, deeply, but they also wondered. If prayers had gone unanswered, if incense had failed, if holy water had done nothing, then where did the old explanations stand? Belief did not disappear, but it changed. A quiet skepticism entered the European mind, like a draught through a cracked door. It would take centuries for that draught to become a wind. But the hinge first loosened here. Families rebuilt themselves out of what remained. A household of 5 might now be a household of 2. A surviving grandparent raised children not their own. Workshops hired apprentices who had barely learned their craft. Towns buried old officials and elected new ones. Fields sprouted weeds, then wheat again. The world did not recover all at once. It mended in pieces, unevenly, like a tapestry rewoven with threads that no longer quite matched. And yet, life found its way forward. The plague returned, again and again, in waves. Every generation, after 1348, lived with the memory of what it could do. Some towns kept plague pits open for decades. Some cities recorded every death in narrow ledgers, the numbers rising and falling like breath. But each return carried slightly less terror. People began to notice patterns. They watched the markets, the seasons, the rats in the granaries. They cleaned the streets more often. They kept travellers at a distance. In some ports, a ship was told to wait 40 days before unloading. 40 days. A quarantino. It was not yet science, but it was the beginning of public health, born not from theory, but from remembering. And beneath all of this were the people who lived through it. Children who survived when their older siblings did not. Parents who rebuilt kitchens with only 2 chairs. Traders who learned to read the movement of rumours as carefully as the movement of caravans. They were the first generation of a different Europe. Quieter at first, but one that would grow and build and create. Somewhere, in a village half forgotten now, a surviving farmer walked the length of his field in spring and knew that every green shoot was a kind of beginning. Somewhere else, in the corner of a crowded city, a scribe set his pen to parchment again. The first word he wrote after the plague years was simply year, because life, carefully and haltingly, had resumed. And somewhere, a young mason picked up his tools and began building the walls of a house that would one day outlast him and the century that followed. The plague had remade the world, not suddenly, not kindly, but thoroughly. And the survivors, those who walked through these years with fear and hunger and astonishing resilience, were the architects of what came next. In the hush that follows a great fear, people begin to notice small things again. The sound a door makes when it opens early in the morning, the smell of bread as it comes out of the oven, the way light falls on a street that used to be crowded and is now only busy at the edges. After the Black Death, Europe did not hold a single day of mourning. There was no ceremony large enough. Grief lived in private places, in the way a name caught in the throat, in the empty chair at a table, in the habit of turning to speak to someone who was no longer there. And alongside that grief, something else took root. A stubborn, ordinary courage. A woman returning to market with fewer coins in her purse and fewer people to bargain with. A boy sweeping a workshop, learning a craft from a master who had inherited the tools only months before. A priest stepping to the altar in a half-empty church, aware of how many candlesticks no longer needed lighting. The catastrophes of history are often told in numbers. Half the town, a third of the kingdom, whole villages gone. But for the people inside those years, life was not lived as a statistic. It was lived one morning at a time. You wake, you count who is still under the roof. You give thanks, or you do not. You rise, you fetch water. You place a log on the fire. You say a name softly to yourself, just to keep it in the world a little longer. Tonight, we have walked with them for a while. We have stood beside a lake in the high country of Asia. We have traced caravan routes to a walled town on the Black Sea. We have watched ships limp into Messina, listened to bells in Avignon and London, and stepped quietly through streets that smelled of smoke and rain and fear. We have moved between what we know and what we can only guess, between chronicles and silence, between numbers on a page and the lives behind them. If you are drifting in and out of sleep now, that is all right. History is patient. It does not mind if you miss a line. It will be here when you return. What matters, for this moment, is the feeling of the thread that runs from those years to this one, from the hands that buried and rebuilt, to your hands, holding whatever this day has given you. You are here because someone survived. Not one person, but many. A chain of choices and chances and quiet continuings, stretching back through plague and war and hunger and ordinary time. Someone stayed with the sick instead of fleeing. Someone shared food when there was just enough. Someone crossed a sea. someone decided to have a child, even in a world that had just shown how fragile life could be. You carry the quiet victory of all of that in your bones. There is a candle here with us now, even if you cannot see it. In imagination, you can place it wherever you like, on a stone windowsill, on a small wooden table, on the floor beside a sleeping mat. Its light is not fierce. It does not push the darkness away. It simply makes a small circle of gentleness inside it. Within that circle, we can lay a few things down. The memory of those whose names were never written, the fear of not understanding, the weight of knowing that the world can change without warning, and beside them, we can place something else. A simple thank you for the people we never met who kept going long enough for you to exist. A baker in Siena, a scribe in Damascus, a midwife in a village whose name has been lost, a child who lived when others did not. They will never know you. You will never know them. But the line between you is real. Let the candle burn for them, and for you, and for the part of you that is tired right now and deserves rest. This is not the end of the story of the plague. It will return in other years, in other places. But that can wait. For tonight, you have walked far enough. Let the bells in your mind fall silent. Let the roads empty. Let the harbour lights go out, one by one, until only the small candle remains. And then, when you are ready, let even that fade, gently, into the dark behind your eyes. You are safe now. You are here. You are the descendant of survivors. Rest well. Good night.